other Englishmen and channeling the blues and creating psychedelia in a lot of the ways that he did and all that. I mean, there's that famous story about Eric Clapton bringing him out on stage to play with them. And then he gets so
getting
mad.
His ass whooped by Hendrix. Yeah.
And he gets so mad because he's not that good.
But you bring up a good point. I mean, Hendrix, I think, is the obvious counterpoint to Clapton when you're talking about greatest guitarists ever, or most important, influential. The other one being Jimmy Page. Clapton has his place in the pantheon, but I just cannot unseat Hendrix. And I think that's always been part of the chip on Clapton's shoulder that makes him more annoying.
Well, let's talk about that chip more. So a lot of what he expressed, a lot of what Eric Clapton expressed about his confusion about Jimi Hendrix or his reservation about it was that Hendrix was showy, lit his guitar on fire and did all kinds of stuff, right? The things that made Hendrix compelling as an artist, but Hendrix was still a phenomenal guitar player, right? So
made it look so easy.
Right.
He never once looked like he was trying, which I think made him a target for jealousy and confusion and resentment.
It surfaced in Eric Clapton, and I'm sure other people, but Eric Clapton was really vocal about it at the time, so he's going to pay for it now that we're talking about this record.
I mean, and he spent a lot of time on that. He really zeroed in on him specifically, so he earned it.
So one of the things that confused Eric Clapton was that Hendrix, for all intents and purposes to him, was black. Now, Hendrix was actually like pretty mixed, but to Eric Clapton, he was a black man coming over who should be a blues purist who Eric Clapton was trying to imitate. But Hendrix added things on top of it, right? Created showmanship, went well beyond, pushed into things, went psychedelic, went long, went improv, and did all these things that would confuse Eric Clapton because in his mind, adherence to the blues was racial.
Yeah. I need you to be this thing for me.
And so much so that in 1966, when Cream was kind of picking up and he was really trying to do this, Eric Clapton said, "I'm no longer trying to play anything but like a white man. The time is overdue when people should play like they are and what color they are." Which is a statement that doesn't age well. And we probably could have said that 6 months after he said it.
There is a Telegraph retrospective that I found titled, "Is Eric Clapton Still God? His Fellow Musicians Weigh In." Whatever. So there's this whole long passage about his relationship with the blues and how it was sort of different than some of the other guys. Because the other counterpoint that I've always had with Cream is the Stones. So when we talk about Clapton being like the best blues guy, I always wondered why we were talking about him rather than Keith Richards. And it was really the improvisation thing. It was taking it and kind of turning it into a different language. But there's this interesting thing that Clapton himself said. He said you had to consciously steer a path toward black soul or blues. Most of the players in the rock framework were coming from a rockabilly stance, which still influenced by the blues, but already filtered once through country music, if you will. Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck grew up listening to white guitar players like Scotty Moore and Cliff Gallup. I was obsessed with black blues guitar players, and for me, the ultimate problem was trying to shift that style into a Chuck Berry rock format. He went on to say, blues is a language you have to learn, like learning French. It's not about a feeling, it's an action. There's a lot to learn, and it means going to the library and listening to just about everything that was ever done and trying to learn from that, which is the literal opposite of what the blues is. The blues is a feeling. Like, how could you study something so diligently and get it so wrong?
Even hearing interviews from that time period, or from around then, you can hear the disagreement even between Clapton and Jack Bruce, because Jack Bruce said that he felt like the blues was the beginning of something, but wasn't everything. So it should just be another influence, like any other style of music, onto the thing that you want to do.
He took a much longer view of things as a classical student.
It's such a great example of that stark contrast between the two people who were essentially fronting this band. Clapton seemed to really feel like there was a thing that he had to get right. And I'm not sure who he viewed as the authority figure on ever telling him that he was okay. Whereas Jack Bruce didn't seem to feel inclined to try to do that whatsoever. He didn't feel interested in manipulating his voice or his playing style to, capture the zeitgeist of anything else.
We've spent a little bit of time, I think, essentially dogging on the first record on the studio songs, but it merits saying that White Room is on that record. And by any measure, that's an incredible rock and roll song.
In a white room with black curtains near the station. Black roof country, no gold pavements, tired starlings. Silver horses ran down moonbeams in your dark eyes.
And sort of an extension or maybe a reimagining of a song from a previous record.
The one that Rolling Stone says is the exact same thing. Yeah. From Disraeli Gear's Tales of Brave Ulysses. Yeah, a little.
I think White Room is an interesting example of a blues idea because it is sort of a reworking of Tales of Brave Ulysses. But this was the thing that you pointed out when we were in high school about the blues, about the idea of blues and intellectual property. It was the opposite then of what it is now, right? Everything was shared. Everybody was like working on ideas in almost a communal way. All the way up to the 60s with Willie Dixon writing all this stuff. And then like everybody going out and doing versions of these songs. And that was sort of the idea, right? You wanted to go and play or hear songs that you knew really well for the shared experience. And in some cases, the commiseration around the ideas expressed in these songs, right? That was a much more common thing and still a thing that's really interesting to me where it's like an itch you got to scratch. You hear an idea in your head and you got to keep working it and reworking it until it gets to the place where it's really like a lightning rod, right? You're just trying to get to the core of a thing that you feel way down deep. And White Room, even though it feels weird that it sounds a lot like something that was on the previous record, it doesn't quite get right and have the right energy and intensity and urgency until it becomes White Room. And the use of the wah is really phenomenal and tasteful.
As much as we've talked about Jack Bruce having kind of a confused or different approach to the blues, he didn't need to adapt his style for that song. It worked. Just everything works on that song. And when they would come together and do something that didn't feel like one of them was trying to like pull the middle too far in one of their directions, it just worked as Cream and it was great. And so, I mean, White Room, I'm less of a fan of Sitting on Top of the World, but it's still a good Cream song. I mean, it's a Howlin' Wolf song, right? Which they don't do the way that Howlin' Wolf did at all.
But now she gone.
I think Sitting on Top of the World is actually a Walter Vinson, Mississippi Sheiks song.
But now she's gone, I don't worry. I'm sitting on top of the world.
Well, I mean, even Born Under a Bad Sign was Lightning Slim's song before that.
Right.
It wasn't intellectual property. It was just version 1.1 of this idea.
Did you know that the songwriting credit on Born Under a Bad Sign is Booker T. Jones?
Yeah, he wrote it for Albert King.
Crazy.
I love how collaborative all that stuff was.
I do too.
When he talked about writing that song for Albert King, he was just like, I don't know. I've been thinking for a while about how like the horoscope stuff was pretty popular during the time. So I wonder if we could just write a blues song about it. Then we'll just throw in a couple of things that makes it relevant to the public and we'll make a great blues song. And it totally worked.
Contrasting to Sitting on Top of the World, I think Politician is the other really interesting example to me, because they did take a, sort of a blues approach, but really made it their own thing. And the material is a lot different. There's not a lot of super political blues in the real focus sense, but this is like a really pointed song about political corruption, which was an interesting thing because so much of their other material was so abstract. I think any self-respecting music fan worth their stripes has to understand us grappling with this and having mixed feelings about it. Like, I want to be very clear that as music fans, we have a lot of respect for a lot of the things that were being done here. They still managed to achieve a gestalt. They still managed to do something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. And we weren't there in that moment. I think I learned from the feedback on the Husker Du episode that like some of it really is about time and place. And I know that it tremendously impacted a lot of the things that went on to impact me. So I acknowledge that there's a distance between me and this thing that I can never cover, but I understand how it got there to me. I think the other thing that I want to talk about kind of in closing is what else they went on to do and how they just sort of became more interesting in some ways on their own. So you start with Clapton. The immediate thing is Blind Faith, where he would go on with Steve Winwood from Traffic and do this really interesting, different thing. And I don't really want to talk about Delaney and Bonnie. It's just never really been my thing. But then Derek and the Dominoes, which was with Dwayne Allman, who has been a huge influence on both of us. You want to talk about great guitar music? That's the pantheon, because that's as good as it gets, with two guitarists doing two really different things and it coming together and making sense. So I didn't really keep up with Jack Bruce after Cream, but Ginger Baker is really fascinating because he's such a madman and always scared a lot of people. A lot of the quotes talked about what an intense person he was. And to watch that BBC Royal Albert Hall interview, he's a scary dude. His whole vibe is very off-putting. So I sort of relearned Cream because Ginger Baker joined Masters of Reality with Chris Goss, who's a desert guy. But there was this phenomenal drumming that he did on their record Sunrise on the Suffer Bus. And I don't remember how I stumbled across it, but it was the song Tilt-A-Whirl. I was like, man, who's the drummer on this record? It's really incredible. And it was like, it's Ginger Baker. And then read these interviews about how stoked they were to have Ginger Baker in the band. And I was like, oh, he's the guy from Cream. And so that was really interesting that he was significantly older than all of those guys, but was just continuing to just pop in on things that he found interesting. I don't know. These dudes fascinate me because I don't understand what motivates them at all to be alive or do anything that they do. But then they just keep doing it. So I think all we can do is study these artifacts and try to forensically construct a portrait of where this stuff came from. Because it's a lot easier with other people, but it is just not easy to understand these guys at all.
I always imagine Ginger Baker having just eaten a mushroom, but that he didn't study before he ate it. So he's like, to be honest, I don't know if I'm about to trip all the way out or die during this interview. I didn't check. That's just kind of how I live. I picked it up and I ate it. Do you want one? Okay. Yeah, no, I'll be fine. This is how I drum.